I never imagined that the person I chose to spend the rest of my life with would betray me in such a calculated, devastating way. I'm a 31-year-old man, and for 4 years I was married to Becky, a 27-year-old woman whom I believed was my soulmate. We first crossed paths during college, a time when the world still felt like it made sense. I was in the final stretch of my business degree, pulling long nights and preparing for the farm I'd one day run, while Becky was deep into her marketing studies, full of ideas and dreams she'd sketch in the margins of her notebooks. I remember the exact moment I met her like it was etched in slow motion. It was at a tailgate party before the homecoming football game. My friends and I were goofing around, tossing a football, grilling burgers, just enjoying the fall air and the buzz of school spirit. Becky stood out immediately. She kept stealing glances in our direction, laughing with her friends, but clearly distracted. Eventually, she and her crew wandered over, and that's when she pulled the classic, oops, maneuvering, bumping into me and sending her drink splashing all over my favorite jersey. I still remember the shocked look on her face. I just chuckled and said, "Well, I guess you owe me dinner now," in the cheesiest tone possible. Her cheeks turned bright red, and she apologized about a dozen times before finally asking for my number. That clumsy, unplanned moment marked the beginning of something that, at the time, felt like magic. We started seeing each other, slowly at first, then like wildfire. Late-night talks that stretched into early mornings became our norm. I shared things I hadn't told anyone, about losing my dad when I was 15, about helping my mom run the family farm when most kids my age were out partying. Becky opened up too, revealing how she was raised by strict, devoutly religious parents, the kind who believed in modesty, scripture, and Sunday potlucks. We'd sit in my old pickup truck, gazing at the stars, making plans. She would sketch out her dream homes, while I talked endlessly about livestock and irrigation systems, and to my surprise, she never seemed bored. After 2 years of dating, I proposed at her favorite lake spot, the one she used to visit as a kid. I spent months saving for a ring that made her cry the moment she opened the box. That night, wrapped in each other's arms, she whispered that she couldn't wait to have kids with me, to build a real family together. Fast forward a few years, and I genuinely believed I had it all. A marriage that felt strong, my own successful farm, and a future I'd painstakingly crafted. Nothing was handed to me, not a penny. Every acre I owned was earned through back-breaking 70-hour weeks, taking out risky loans, and making smart bets on equipment and land. I had transformed 40 acres of tired, stubborn soil into a thriving operation that brought in nearly $300,000, 0 cents the previous year. Becky never wanted for anything. I gave her the life she dreamed of, or so I thought. When we tied the knot, we made big promises. Kids, a stable home, traditions we'd passed down. But about a year into our marriage, Becky started pushing back on the whole "let's start a family" idea. She said things like, "Maybe we should wait a bit longer," or "I'm not sure I'm ready yet." I was disappointed, yeah. But I wasn't going to pressure her. Instead, I threw myself deeper into building the life she said she wanted. She was always drawn to this romanticized idea of country living, except her version was wildly expensive. She insisted on buying a 6-figure purebred horse just for appearances. That animal rarely saw a saddle. It stood in the pasture like a lawn ornament while I paid thousands every month in feed, vet bills, and training. Then came the imported Brahman cattle. Because, according to her, regular cows didn't match her aesthetic. She actually called our Herefords too basic. And don't even get me started on the trucks. She wanted a brand new diesel every year. Not because we needed it, but because last year's model wasn't stylish enough. Despite my grumbling, I paid for it all. I thought if I kept her happy, we'd eventually get back on the same page. But that page was already being rewritten behind my back. Everything began unraveling when Becky's longtime friend Emily reached out with an unexpected text. Emily and I weren't particularly close. She was Becky's childhood friend, always scraping by financially, posting about her side hustles on social media that never seemed to go anywhere. She worked full-time as a vet tech and bartended on weekends at a dive bar called the Rusty Nail. I figured she was planning a surprise party or maybe needed help with some new scheme. She asked to stop by when Becky wasn't home. I didn't think much of it. When she showed up, though, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her eyes darted around like she was expecting to be caught. I offered her coffee. She declined. "This won't take long," she said, voice low and serious. Then she pulled out a manila folder, dropped it on the kitchen table, and said words that chilled me. "You need to see this." At first, I assumed it was a pitch for that organic pet food business she kept yammering about. She believed traditional kibble was poison and had some miracle recipe that healed her cat's digestion. But when I opened the folder, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a business proposal. It was the burial site of my marriage. Inside were pages upon pages of meticulously gathered evidence. Screenshots, photos, videos, receipts, all of it documents Becky's ongoing affair with Dr. Jason Cooper, the town veterinarian. The same guy who charged me $5,000 to treat one of our horses, only to send a Christmas card later featuring his smiling family. His wife Katie, by the way, is a Sunday school teacher and organizes the annual church charity auction. The hypocrisy burned. There were over 70 pages of betrayal in that folder. Emily had color-coded sticky notes, tabs by date, and even printed explanations for each piece of evidence. She had done her homework with surgical precision. I flipped through image after image, graphic photos I wish I could unsee, hotel bookings matched against dates Becky claimed she was visiting her mom, and even driveway security cam footage of Jason's truck pulling up 20 minutes after I left for a work trip. Becky. What? The worst part? 2 days later, that same camera showed Becky and Jason leaving the house together. They were holding hands, laughing, kissing, next to his truck, like they hadn't just detonated the foundation of someone else's life. Inside that thick folder of devastation, one section hit harder than all the rest: the screenshots. Hundreds of text messages were exchanged between Becky and Jason, going back at least 8 months. The content was sickening. Phrases like, "Can't wait till he leaves again," and "Don't worry, baby, he doesn't suspect a thing," made my hands tremble with fury. Reading those words felt like taking a direct hit to the chest from one of those heavy Brahman cows Becky insisted we buy for her dream aesthetic. You don't realize how hard betrayal hits until it's spelled out in black and white. Until you see the affection, the inside jokes, the coordinated lies all in plain view. Every so-called girls' trip Becky had gone on during the past several months had nothing to do with her friends. Instead, they were intimate getaways with the same vet who pretended to be our friend, who smiled at our barbecues. And every time I traveled across state lines to buy farm equipment, she invited him into our home, into our bed. I discovered from the security cam footage that his truck had stayed overnight on our property at least 11 times when I was out of town. One image that crushed me was a receipt dated 3 months prior from a luxury hotel in Memphis. Becky had claimed she was on a relaxing spa weekend with Emily and 2 other friends. I didn't even question it, but here's the kicker. Emily was in the Bahamas that exact weekend. I remembered clearly because she posted over 50 sunny beach photos on her social media, lounging with pina coladas and snorkeling with sea turtles. So, who were these mysterious friends Becky claimed to be with? No one. It was just her and Jason, enjoying a romantic suite, on my dime. And it wasn't just the cheating. It escalated into something far worse. Becky was pregnant, but not with my child, with his, the vet's. I had taken her to the doctor myself, concerned when she started acting more fatigued, more nauseous. I thought it might be something serious, maybe hormonal, all while she was texting Jason selfies with captions like, "Your baby is making me sick today, can't wait to tell him it's his so he'll stop bugging me about having kids." Another screenshot from 3 weeks ago still burns in my brain. She texted him, "I think I'm going to have to tell him soon, starting to show a little." He responded, "What are you going to tell him?" And she replied, "That it's his, obviously. He's been begging for kids. He'll be so excited he won't even think to do the math." I had to walk outside after reading that. My vision blurred as I stood in the yard trying not to scream or throw something. I felt hollow, enraged, and humiliated all at once. The woman I'd devoted my life to was not only cheating, she was planning to raise another man's child, under my roof, in my name, funded by my work, my money. When I came back inside, Emily was calmly scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table, like she hadn't just shattered my world. "How long have you known?" I asked, voice tight with disbelief. She set her phone down slowly and said, "I suspected something 6 months ago, but I've had solid proof for about 3. It took a while to collect everything." "Why now? Why tell me?" I asked. That's when she shifted in her seat, her eyes darting away. "Look, I know this is all kinds of messed up," she began, not meeting my gaze. "But I need to get out of here. I want a fresh start. That organic pet food business idea I told you about? I've got everything mapped out. I just need startup capital." I stared at her, confused and furious. "So wait. You're telling me all this because you want me to invest in your business?" She shook her head quickly. "No, not like that. Look, the truth is, Becky found out I had screenshots of our conversation. It happened during a girls' night last month. She went to the bathroom, left her phone unlocked. I saw her messages to Jason. She was texting him right in front of me. I took pictures of the texts with my phone. She caught me as I was backing out of her gallery. She lost it, threatened me, Said if I told you or anyone else, she'd destroy my reputation. Claimed her dad would make sure I never worked again in this county. Emily gave a bitter, hollow laugh. I'm screwed either way. So I figured I'd at least do one decent thing before leaving. Plus, she's been spreading rumors, telling people I hit on Jason and he rejected me, and people are starting to believe her. I didn't know whether to trust Emily, but the evidence didn't lie. The timestamps, the pictures, the overlapping timelines with Becky's cover stories, they all matched. I asked how she gathered so much. She admitted that 2 friends helped track Becky and collect data. According to her, she just wanted to protect herself from whatever nuclear fallout Becky was preparing to unleash. So what do you want exactly? I asked, bracing for the pitch. Call it a loan or investment, she said. $50,000. The pet food market's booming, and I've got a legit plan. I just need someone to believe in me. And here's the weird part. I kind of admired her for that. At least Emily was upfront about her motives. That's more than I could say for my wife. Plus, if not for her, I'd still be blind, planning to raise another man's child, oblivious to the betrayal in my own home. Whether Emily's motives were pure or selfish, she was saving me from wasting even more time, more love, more life. Leave the business plan, I said. Let me deal with this first, then we'll talk. She nodded, visibly relieved. As she opened the door to leave, she paused and turned back. For what it's worth, I always thought you deserved better than her. Yeah, sure, I thought, like I was going to fall for a line like that. But the truth was, I did owe her. She could have kept this all to herself. She didn't. I spent the rest of that evening combing through the folder. They had joked about me in their messages, full-on ridicule, laughed about how clueless I was, how I worked myself ragged while they played. They called me Farmer ATM and joked about my long trips giving them uninterrupted weekends. They even laughed about the expensive farm equipment I bought, mocking me for how it bought them time to be alone. I pulled up our joint bank accounts and started comparing transactions. Over $115,000 0 cents had vanished in the past 8 months. Withdrawals I didn't authorize, charges from jewelry stores for items I never saw, a weekend at a mountain cabin I'd never visited. But the final blow? Screenshots of Becky's texts with her parents. Becky's parents, Pastor Robert and his wife Susan, were the type of people who seemed molded straight out of a conservative family values catalog. For over 2 decades, they'd projected an air of moral superiority so intense it could practically knock the wind out of anyone less than perfect. Pastor Robert wasn't just a local preacher. He was the face of First Baptist Church, the largest congregation in the county, with more than 500 members. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a social status marker. If you were someone of influence or aspiration, that's where you showed up every Sunday, shook hands, and let the whole town know you were righteous. He drove a gleaming Cadillac Escalade, technically church property for ministry purposes, but let's be honest, it was a luxury status symbol. Susan, his always composed and perfectly coiffed wife, ran the women's ministry with military precision. She chaired half a dozen charity committees, hosted brunches, organized prayer circles, and still managed to be everywhere at once. For years, they looked down their noses at others in town, acting like God's gatekeepers, talking endlessly about morals, family values, and how America was sliding into sin because people didn't live by their holy standards. And yet, these paragons of virtue knew. They knew their daughter had been carrying on a sordid affair with another man. They knew she was pregnant with that man's child, and what did they do? Did they intervene? Demand accountability? No. They cover it all up to maintain the illusion of their unblemished family and protect their status. I saw the proof myself. Text messages between Becky and her mother. One message read, "Mom, I'm freaking out. Emily knows about Jason and me. What if she tells him?" The response from Susan was chilling. "Don't worry, honey. Your father will handle it. Emily's mother still needs that recommendation letter for the school board job. She won't risk losing it." Then there was a message from Pastor Robert to Becky. "We've spoken with Emily. She understands what's at stake. Just be more cautious moving forward." These were the same people who'd welcomed me into their home every Sunday for dinner. The same man who used to clasp my shoulder and call me son. The same woman who constantly asked when we were going to make her a grandmother. All smiles and sermons, while secretly orchestrating the deception of a lifetime. I kept reading, stunned and enraged. In another thread they discussed how to manage the pregnancy. Pastor Robert wrote, "I've been thinking about your situation. The most prudent course for now is to let him believe the child is his. When Jason's situation is resolved and his practice is relocated, we can reassess. After a suitable period, You may proceed with a divorce. Consider it a form of penance for prior misjudgments. The alternative is reputational fallout and jeopardizing my role at the church." And just like that, it all fell into place. The plan was to keep me in the dark, let me believe I was going to be a father, and have me raise another man's child while Jason worked on leaving his wife. Once he was free and had relocated nearby, Becky would divorce me under the guise of growing apart, and then move on to a public relationship with Jason. All carefully staged to protect her father's job and the family's image. I stared at the messages in disbelief. These were the same people who prayed over our marriage on our wedding day, who gave us a family Bible inscribed with notes about honoring your vows before God. The depth of their hypocrisy was staggering. Suddenly, all their behavior over the past few months made sense. Their constant visits, their frequent calls to Becky, their sudden interest in our routines. They weren't being carrying in-laws. They were managing damage control, orchestrating a scandal like political operatives. For 4 years, I had sat in those pews every Sunday listening to Pastor Robert preach about truth, honor, and the sanctity of marriage. I donated money to church renovations, helped with food drives, and even volunteered at men's fellowship nights. I had looked up to them, seen them as my spiritual guides, my family. Now, I saw them for what they were, liars, playing dress-up in righteousness. Once I had combed through every last text, every email, every damning detail, I tucked everything back into the folder and locked it away in my safe. They thought I was naive, that I'd just continue being the hard-working, blind fool. But I grew up on a farm, and farm boys learn early, trust has to be earned, and deceit doesn't go unpunished. I wasted no time. First thing the next morning, I called a divorce lawyer. Marcus, a sharp guy from a firm 3 counties over, so word wouldn't leak in our tight-knit community. We talked for nearly an hour. I gave him a high-level rundown and promised to send over the full evidence file. For the next 48 hours, I acted normally, fed the cattle, checked the irrigation systems, and had coffee with Becky like I always did. I even endured Sunday dinner at her parents' house, the very day after uncovering the truth. I watched Pastor Robert bow his head and say grace, asking God to bless this food and this family. I had to bite my cheek not to laugh. The whole scene felt like a grotesque play, and I was playing the part of the clueless husband to perfection. Monday morning, I told Becky I needed to check on a distant field, something about a moisture issue. Instead, I drove 40 miles to a Starbucks across the county line and called Marcus from the parking lot. He asked if we had a prenuptial agreement. We didn't, but it turned out our state doesn't recognize community property laws. Translation: Becky could only claim what she could prove she financially contributed to. Considering she'd blown through money on failing online boutiques, spa weekends, and designer maternity clothes, her stake was minimal. The farm was solely in my name, purchased before marriage. That meant she had no legal claim to it, no house, no land, no future income, just a growing pile of debt and a baby that, thanks to all this evidence, could be proven not to be mine. Marcus was thrilled. With this kind of documentation and proof of infidelity, he said, you're in an excellent legal position. Courts don't take kindly to this level of manipulation, especially when it involves paternity fraud and misuse of marital funds. He walked me through the next steps. Filing temporary protective orders, initiating the discovery process, and preparing a detailed financial record. I printed out bank statements that showed money withdrawn on days matching her hotel stays. I cataloged receipts, pulled tax documents, and even produced phone call recordings, all completely legal thanks to our state's one-party consent law. Marcus was practically cheering over the phone. With this much material, not only can we shut down any claims she might make, but we may also be able to pursue a fraud claim, he explained. Knowingly misrepresenting the paternity of a child during a marriage can legally qualify as fraud. And if she used shared finances to support the affair, that's misappropriation. That's grounds for legal restitution. Becky wanted freedom. She could have it all, the space in the world, but she wouldn't get it at the expense of my finances. While my attorney Marcus pushed the legal gears into motion, I took steps to quietly shield myself. I began transferring a significant portion of our liquid assets into personal accounts that only I controlled, not every cent. I left just enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but I made sure that if she got the bright idea to drain our joint savings, she'd find the well dry. Then I called Rick, a real estate agent who specialized in agricultural properties across our county. He came out and inspected the farm top to bottom. After reviewing the land, equipment, crop yields, and livestock, he gave me a valuation that was nearly 30% higher than I expected. Turns out, commercial development had been creeping closer to our area, pushing land prices through the roof. Rick told me that the second my divorce was finalized, he could have the place sold within weeks, if not days. By the time Becky even realized what was happening, I'd be long gone, financially and physically. I wasn't just plotting my escape, I was planning a restart. I started scouting cattle operations across the Midwest, particularly Montana. I found one listing for a property nearly 500 miles away that caught my eye. More land, a better water supply, a newer farmhouse, and enough infrastructure to rival what I'd spent a decade building. And the kicker? It was listed for less than what mine would likely sell for. I made a few calls, floated some feelers, and kept the option open. Meanwhile, Becky, unaware her fantasy life was crumbling behind the scenes, started laying the groundwork for the next phase of her performance. She began turning down wine at dinner, casually mentioning morning nausea, and strategically placing saltine crackers on her nightstand. All theatrics, subtle cues to get me used to the idea that she was expecting. She was building up to the big reveal. One night, she curled up next to me on the couch and, with a soft voice, brought up our future. "Maybe we should revisit the idea of having kids," she murmured. I nodded, said all the right things, and smiled at all the right moments. Inside, I felt absolutely nothing. Maintaining the act was emotionally draining, but oddly satisfying. Every fake smile I returned, every nod I gave as she lied through her teeth, only confirmed I was doing the right thing. These people, her parents, Jason, deserved every ounce of what was coming. Marcus kept in touch every couple of days. He updated me on the legal filings, said he'd found multiple precedents we could leverage to fortify our case. He also lined up a process server, a guy named Derek, who specialized in high-conflict and sensitive deliveries. When he asked me how I wanted the papers served, privately at home or more publicly, I paused. That's when I started thinking about Thanksgiving. Every year, Becky's family hosted a grand celebration after the morning service at First Baptist. It wasn't just a meal, it was an event. Their sprawling house would be packed to the gills with extended family, fellow churchgoers, key donors, and close friends. The setting was as performative as everything else in their lives, a perfect stage. I had a heart-to-heart with Mike, my farm manager of 3 years. He was rock solid, a man I trusted with my operation and my silence. I explained I might have to leave town quickly and asked if he could hold the reins while I was gone. Without hesitation, Mike nodded. "Whatever you need, boss," he said. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I arranged a meeting with Emily at a quiet diner 2 towns over. I handed her an envelope containing a check for $225,000. 0 cents. "Half now," I told her, "and the other half once the dust settles." She blinked in surprise but nodded. "You still want me to come to Thanksgiving dinner like nothing's wrong?" she asked. "Exactly," I said. "You're still invited, right?" She smiled grimly. "Susan called yesterday to confirm. I think they're afraid of what I'll do if they uninvite me." "Perfect," I said. "Just show up early and act like everything's fine." Then she dropped another gem. "Jason and Katie will be there too. Susan invited them last month." Even better. The whole cast of this twisted play would be assembled. Becky, her parents, Jason the vet and his wife Katie. No better setting for the truth to make its grand entrance. 2 nights before Thanksgiving, I visited my old buddy Tom in his garage. We'd been friends since high school. He was elbows deep tuning his Harley when I told him everything, the only person I confided in. "Just serve the papers at home and get it over with," he said. "All this production isn't necessary." "It's not about spectacle," I told him. "It's about consequences. These people walk around like they're untouchable. It's time they learn they're not." He shook his head. "It's your funeral, man. Just don't ask me to help bury any bodies." I laughed. "No bodies, just egos." As I drove home that night, something unexpected happened. I felt peace. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry. I wasn't anxious. I was calm. Everything was falling into place. The papers were ready, the server was prepped, the timing was set. In less than 48 hours, Becky and her entire sanctimonious family would discover their carefully built house of lies had one fatal flaw. They underestimated me. They thought I'd crumble, thought I'd cry and beg and fall apart. But I'm not a city boy raised on comfort and entitlement. I was raised on a farm, where animals die, crops fail, and machinery breaks when you need it most. And when disaster strikes, you don't fall to pieces. You clean it up and move forward. Now came the fun part. Thanksgiving Day. In our town, Thanksgiving at First Baptist is practically a second Christmas. Pastor Robert's harvest service is a spectacle. The sanctuary gets decked out, with hay bales, corn stalks, and autumn leaves. Church elders, donors, and community leaders pack the pews, dressed in their Sunday best, shaking hands and smiling for photos. After the service, the inner circle heads to the pastor's mansion for dinner. It's always a crowded affair, 30 or 40 people jammed into every available inch of the dining and living rooms. Susan starts baking a week in advance, though most of the food comes catered from an upscale restaurant in the city. She always acts like she made it all herself. Becky and I were expected to arrive early to help set up. For me, that meant hauling chairs and tables while Becky and Susan gossiped in the kitchen. Pastor Robert always made a dramatic show of carving the turkey in front of everyone, followed by a long-winded blessing that doubled as a sermon. 3 days before, I confirmed everything with Marcus. The final divorce packets were complete, individual envelopes labeled for Becky, Pastor Robert, and Susan. Extras printed, just in case. The process server, Derek, was scheduled for 2:00 p.m., right as the turkey would hit the table and all eyes would be on Pastor Robert's knife. Lastly, I called Emily. "You still good for the plan?" I asked. Her voice was steady. "Everyone's still expecting me there," she said. Emily confirmed everything with a quiet nod over the phone. Susan called yesterday to finalize the head count, said to be there by 1:30. "Perfect. Act normal," I told her, "and make sure your phone's charged." "Down there. Why, you going to need me to do something?" "No," I said, "but trust me, you'll want to record what happens." The day before Thanksgiving, Becky was a blur of motion. She raced through the kitchen, baking pies. Well, technically she was reheating pre-made bakery pies and transferring them into our ceramic dishes to make it look homemade. Her performance was flawless, if not for the price tags I found still attached to the plastic containers she threw out. As I sipped coffee at the kitchen counter, she called over her shoulder, "Can you pick up my dress from the dry cleaner?" I nodded, standing. "Sure. Anything else?" She tapped her chin for a second. "Maybe grab some flowers for the centerpiece? You know how much Mom loves it when we bring flowers." "You got it." I drove into town, grabbed her dress, and stopped at the florist. I ordered the most expensive bouquet they had. Slush, autumn blooms in rich, fiery colors. When the florist asked if I wanted to include a card, I shook my head and smiled. "Well, card. The flowers will speak for themselves." That evening, while Becky fussed over silverware polish and tablescapes, I quietly packed a small overnight bag and stashed it under the seat of my truck. A few changes of clothes, my laptop, some documents, and a few $100s in cash. I'd already booked a motel 60 miles out of town. Nothing fancy, just a clean place to disappear for a few days after the dust settled. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake with my heart racing, my mind running through every step of the plan. It felt a bit like Christmas Eve as a kid, except instead of presents, I was waiting to deliver the emotional equivalent of a nuclear bomb to a house full of liars and hypocrites. Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and crisp. I got up early and put on my best suit, the one I usually reserved for weddings and funerals. It felt fitting. Becky spent more than an hour on her makeup and hair, smoothing down the tight emerald green dress she'd bought just last week. It hugged her body in a way that subtly emphasized the barely there bump she thought I hadn't noticed. The church was a spectacle as usual. First Baptist was packed to the rafters. Nearly 600 people crammed into every pew. Pastor Robert gave his annual Thanksgiving sermon, thundering about gratitude, the strength of family, and the sacred bond of marriage. Several times, his eyes lingered on me as he waxed poetic about trust and the covenant between husband and wife. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. "God sees our hearts," he bellowed. "He knows our true intentions. There is no hiding from his sight." Indeed. After the service, the lobby buzzed with greetings, handshakes, and small talk. Pastor Robert worked the crowd like a seasoned politician, shaking hands with every major donor, smiling for photos with elders. Susan glided through the room, handing out leftover programs and reminding invited guests about the dinner at their home later that afternoon. I spotted Emily near the coffee table. She caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. Showtime was drawing near. By 1:00, guests began arriving at the pastor's home, an expansive colonial-style house just outside of town. It was the same guest list as every year. Church elders and their spouses, Becky's brother and his family, her grandmother from the upscale retirement community, a smattering of cousins, and the special guests, a recently relocated doctor and his wife who were shopping for a church, and a real estate developer who'd expressed interest in donating land for a youth center. At 1:45, nearly everyone had a glass of sparkling cider or sweet tea in hand, chatting politely. The Baptists in town rarely drank alcohol, at least not where other Baptists could see them. I stood near the front window, casually checking my phone. At exactly 1:55, a text from Derek buzzed across the screen. In position, 5 minutes. I inhaled deeply, turned to the crowd and spoke just loud enough to command attention. Everyone, Pastor Robert would like to get started. Please find your name cards and take your seats. There was a gentle shuffling of chairs, rustling of place cards, and murmured conversations. Becky took her seat beside me, fidgeting slightly. Her eyes were a little too wide, her smile a little too tight. I could tell she was nervous, probably gearing up to make her big pregnancy announcement. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Her father stood at the head of the long table, his carving knife in hand, wearing his signature Thanksgiving apron. Before we begin this wonderful meal, he began, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. Ding dong. The doorbell rang. Susan began to rise from her seat. No, Pastor Robert interrupted, holding out a hand. You sit. I'm sure it's just a late arrival. Still wearing his apron, he walked toward the front door. From the dining room, I could hear the door open and his voice say, I'm sorry, we're in the middle of a family dinner. Then a second voice, calm and professional. I'm looking for Rebecca Mitchell. There was a beat of silence. Then Pastor Robert's voice again, this time strained. Becky, there's someone here for you. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Becky. She rose slowly, confusion etched on her face, and walked to the entryway. Standing there was Derek, dressed in a dark blazer, a stack of envelopes in hand. These are for you, he said, handing Becky the thickest envelope. And these are for Robert and Susan Johnson, he continued, extending 2 more. Pastor Robert took the papers numbly, as if in a trance. You've been served. Have a nice day. Derek turned and walked away, leaving behind a room frozen in disbelief. Becky stared at the envelope in her hands. Pastor Robert looked pale. Susan hadn't even opened hers yet. She was too busy glaring at me, her face filled with shock and something close to fear. Becky opened her envelope, eyes scanning the first page. Her face drained of color, then flushed a deep crimson. She looked up at me. What is this? She whispered. I stood, straightened my suit jacket, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, I believe the technical term is a petition for dissolution of marriage. It also includes evidence of adultery, paternity fraud, and conspiracy to deceive. I turned to her parents. There are copies for both of you, too, since you're named as co-conspirators. Her father tore open his envelope, eyes darting across the pages. Susan just stared, motionless, like someone watching a house burn down with no idea how to save it. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen. The room fell into stunned silence as I held it up for everyone to see. A video clip. Becky and Jason, walking hand in hand out of a hotel, stopped beside his truck to kiss passionately in the parking lot. The timestamp glowed on the screen. 2 months ago. The same weekend Becky claimed she was at a marketing conference in Cincinnati. I've got about 6 hours of this stuff, I said, turning my phone screen so everyone around the long dining table could see. Videos, texts, bank records, GPS logs, and soon, a paternity test. I locked eyes with Becky as I continued, spoiler alert, baby's not mine. For a few seconds, the room froze. Forks hovered mid-air, glasses clinked against nervous fingers. Then Katie, Jason's wife, shot to her feet, knocking her chair backward with a loud scrape. What baby? She demanded, her voice rising above the stunned silence. Jason? What the hell is he talking about? Jason turned a shade of pale I didn't think humanly possible. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I can explain, he croaked finally. I stayed seated, calm, collected. Explain what? I asked. How you been sleeping with my wife? How you knocked her up and then tried to help her pass it off as mine? Or how her parents, your good friends, helped orchestrate the entire cover-up? Before Jason could answer, Pastor Robert slammed a hand down on the table. This is outrageous. How dare you come into my home, on Thanksgiving no less, and throw around these baseless accusations? I laughed, genuinely laughed. Accusations? I pointed at the thick packet still clutched in his trembling hand. Page 12, Pastor. That's the part where you tell Becky to be more careful and discuss options for managing the pregnancy. Pretty specific for something you're calling baseless. He glanced down, his eyes catching the lines of text, his face contorted, not with disbelief, but with guilt. Becky, now flipping rapidly through her own envelope, went from confused to furious to horrified. Where did you get all this? She muttered, voice breaking. How did you? And that's when she saw her. Emily, calmly standing at the edge of the dining room, recording everything with her phone. Becky's expression twisted. "You," she hissed. "You did this." Emily shrugged. "I warned you. Guess your dad's threats didn't work out the way he hoped." Meanwhile, Katie had snatched Jason's packet out of his lap and was scanning through it. Her cheek streaked with tears, she read aloud. 6 months? You've been doing this for 6 months? Her eyes found Becky's, but Becky couldn't look up. She stared at the floor like it might save her from drowning. Around the room, guests were stiff and stunned. A few shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door like escape was the only option. Others stared at their laps, frozen in awkward silence. I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone," I said. "Becky, I'd say I hope the baby's healthy, but I'd be lying. And for the rest of you, maybe next time, don't help bury someone else's lies. Especially you, Pastor. Isn't bearing false witness a sin in your book?" I didn't wait for answers. I didn't need them. Behind me, chaos erupted. Katie shrieked and flung something, what sounded like a crystal gravy boat, straight at Jason, followed by a string of profanities that could make a sailor blush. A chair toppled over with a loud crash. Susan was sobbing into her napkin. Pastor Robert shouted for order while trying to read legal jargon he clearly didn't understand. Guests scrambled for the door, trying to escape what had quickly turned from a holiday feast to a scandalous showdown. I stepped out into the cold autumn air, walked to my truck with a calm I hadn't felt in months, and started the engine. By the time I hit the highway, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. A dozen texts from Becky. "How could you do this? We need to talk. I'm sorry. Please come back." Then the voicemail started, one from her father, angry and threatening. Another, a complete shift, pleading, begging me to come back and talk things over. And then one from Susan, sobbing so uncontrollably I could barely make out her words. I turned the phone off. Let them stew in it. The motel was waiting, small, dingy, and quiet. I pulled in around dusk, checked in under a false name, and locked the door behind me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I had to look over my shoulder. Later that night, I turned the phone back on for a few minutes just to check in with Emily. Her message popped up almost immediately. "Emily, holy mess. That was pure chaos after you left. Jason's wife, she hit him with a gravy boat, square in the forehead." I chuckled, texting back, "When can I get the other half of my money?" "Emily, check your account." I did. The transfer was there, already processed. Thanks. For the show, Emily. Worth every penny. Best Thanksgiving ever. I had to agree. As I lay back on the stiff motel mattress, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the hum of the heater, I felt more at peace than I had in a long time. No more lies, no more games, no more pretending. Tomorrow, I'd call Marcus and go over the next steps: property division, asset transfer, final court filing. But tonight I will sleep, deep and dreamless, knowing that I had served up justice, cold, clean, and utterly deserved.